Next thing we want to talk about is how to help people change their life script. Eric Berne's view of that is that you go through the different components of transactional analysis. You start with structural analysis, you help the person become aware of their ego states and contamination and exclusion. Then you use transactional analysis proper to help them look at how they tend to transact with other people, help them become aware of any games and rackets that they might be using. And then finally, you help them become aware of their life script and to change that by bringing it into awareness and helping the person look at the new show that they want to put on the road as opposed to the old script they've been playing out. Bob and Mary Goulding realized that the early decision that the child makes is really the linchpin of the script. So if you help people go back and change that early decision, it's like pulling out the linchpin and the script dismantles. People no longer have an investment in the rackets and games and so on. So it really provides a shortcut in the therapeutic process. The overall goal in transactional analysis is to help individuals experience themselves as okay, to take back the power and autonomy they had to give up in childhood, to regain their spontaneity, feel safe in being intimate with others, and create the kind of life they want for themselves in the present.
What about external circumstances in the bigger world that are experienced when a child is very small, does not have a language?
There's a lot of pre-verbal trauma that you experienced very early.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Are you wanting to?
I believe that I'm beginning to find out some things about myself by saying, well, I did not have ways to think about this, to put it together.
Yeah, and little kids make early decisions not on the basis of thinking, but feeling and intuition.
Mm-hmm.
So even though you didn't have a way of thinking about it rationally or cognitively, chances are you came to some emotional conclusions about all of that and what you needed to do as a result to survive psychologically.
And what I needed to do as a result is?
To survive psychologically, emotionally in that situation.
Right.
And that, what your example, Sharon, is Bob and Mary Goulding call a third-degree impasse.
Again, what I hear is how much early trauma there was. And the importance, it would really be important to have somebody help you work through that trauma and resolve that. So that was no longer getting triggered in the present. So as we mentioned earlier, transactional analysis is a contractual form of therapy. Contracts are basically a mutual agreement regarding a well-defined outcome. That was Berne's simplest definition of contracts. They define who both people are, what it is they're going to do together, what the outcome of that process is going to be, and how they'll both know once they get there, and how that's going to be beneficial or pleasing to the client. Claude Steiner pointed out that they involve 4 basic elements, just like legal contracts. The first is mutual consent. Both people are agreeing to carry out a certain course of action. Second is valid consideration, which means that the therapist is going to make his or her time, or the consultant or coach or whoever are going to make their time available, and the client is going to reimburse the therapist for that time so that it's not a rescue. A third is competency, that the helping professional is competent to help the person make the change they want to make. And the client themselves is competent to use the tools that the therapist has available in making that change. And then the fourth element is a lawful ethical object, that what they're contracting for is legal and it's within both people's value system. They're not agreeing to something that violates the law or their values. Muriel James suggests 5 questions that are really useful in contracting, and I've added a 5th one, or actually, she suggests 5 questions. I've added a 6th one to that list that I think is helpful. The first is, what could you change about yourself that would really enhance your life? And that's really directed at the child ego state. Second, what would you need to do to accomplish that, which is directed to the adult? How would that be beneficial or pleasing to you, which is directed both at nurturing parent and the child? Fourth, how would you and I both know once you had accomplished that? What would we see in terms of observable behavior to let us know that, yep, you had done that? The third one is, how will that be beneficial or pleasing to you? Which is a question both to the nurturing parent and to the natural child. If there are not any goodies in the contract for the child, the person is not going to do it. The natural child has to want this, be on board. Otherwise, it's an exercise in frustration, because the child is really the one who's going to determine whether they do it or not.
You all may have heard of that as a parent contract.
And a 5th question Muriel asked is, how could you sabotage that? You know, if you really wanted to be devious and make sure you didn't make this change, what would you do? And then, you know, how could you sabotage that? Which is to elicit the unconscious rebellious child motivation to possibly sabotage or not change. You know, some people are still fighting against their parents, rebelling against them to absolutely not do something that the parents might want them to do. And then the question I like to add is, what will you do instead in order to get what you want? If the sabotage would be, I would show up 30 minutes late every time for my therapy sessions, what will you do instead in order to get what you want? I'll come on time.
This may be going back just a sec, but when you were talking about how to change a script and you sort of had the rundown of the different steps in the process, I guess what was coming up for me was a sort of a judgment that this sounds a lot like just trying to bring experiences and feelings into the realm of the cognitive, sort of bring them into awareness, and then if we do that, things start to magically change. And I know there's more to it than that.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, like, how do you place this relative to things that are explicitly emotionally focused, really about feeling the feelings and that being
Right.
a pathway, or the behavioral stuff or like cognitive behavioral therapy?
Well, modern neuroscience really has determined that it's working with the emotional brain that produces lasting change, not with the cognitive brain. It says a little bit about cognitive behavioral therapy. And so what we do to get people into the experience is, whatever the presenting problem is, you have the person be there as though it's now and get in touch with what they're feeling and what they're saying about other people and about themselves to get them into that existential feeling place. And then you can check out, is that familiar? Was there anybody that you were in that kind of position with as a little kid? The whole idea is, when we get stuck in the present, it's because we're interpreting and reacting to the situation in the way that we decided to take care of ourselves as a little kid. So the current situation, when you get the person into the feelings and the thinking of the early situation, into that experience, it will bring up early experiences from the child. And then you have them be in that early scene and get in touch with what's going on, how they're interpreting that, what they're feeling emotionally, and then what they're deciding they're going to do to try to take care of themselves in that early situation. And it will be a very clever decision on the part of the child. I'm always amazed at the decisions that we make as a little kid that really are very clever, smart ways of taking care of ourselves. As the person brings that into awareness, they get in touch with how that is not going to work in the present. And then that motivates them then to redecide that. And you can help them work through the feelings that are unresolved and the needs and so forth they had as a little kid with whoever that main other figure is, and work through that emotionally, which frees them from having to keep repeating that to try to make it different.
Sorry, in the last step, is there action involved or is it internal action?
They are having a dialogue. Usually we use another chair, but they can do it just internally. They're having a dialogue. They're having the conversation with their parent that they didn't know how to have as a little kid to process what was going on and problem solve in the way that Felipe was talking about a little earlier. So they're resolving now, they're finishing up the unfinished business that they didn't get finished as a little kid.
In our workshops, the earliest encounter exercises that we do, and the most recent encounter in which we invite you to see a recent situation, and then the question is, imagine your parent figures are are watching you, and what are they thinking, feeling, and what might they say? You remember those exercises? That's a way of getting experientially at the cultural messages in a similar way to what you were describing, Van, about the person.
Right.
Just quickly, question 5 and 6, were there any ego states?
Yeah, you're really addressing the rebellious child in number 5. And sometimes people will have ways of sabotaging, sometimes they don't. But you're just checking out, you're kind of heading the person off at the pass to find out if there's any way that they would sabotage themselves, and if so, what they will do instead in order to make the contract successful.
Well, I think that they're also obeying the injunctions too in number 5.
Uh-huh.
It may be that how will you sabotage yourself by not thinking or by not succeeding, by not making it.
Right. I want to just show you the difference between contracting versus a psychological game. One of the most common games in therapy is a game called Do Me Something, where the therapist will come in, the client will come in and say to the therapist something like, I've got this terrible problem. I don't know what to do about it. You got to help me. So they're discounting their thinking and their responsibility and attempting to set up a symbiosis with the therapist, where the therapist assumes responsibility and thinks for the client and tells them what to do. So the secret message is, please rescue me, please do me something. You take responsibility and solve it for me. If the therapist starts offering suggestions, well, why don't you do this, or have you tried that, or whatever, without finding out if this is something the person actually wants to solve, the therapist is into rescuing. And initially, the client will feel very grateful for being taken care of like that. But sooner or later, they're going to start resenting the discount of their thinking and their own abilities and so forth, and they're going to come back, and from their parent, they're going to say to the therapist's child, this is not helping. Here, I've been coming for 3 months, and you haven't done a thing for me. And now it's the therapist's responsibility that the client hasn't changed. So the way to avoid that kind of game in therapy is through contracting. So when the client comes in and says, I've got this terrible problem, I don't know what to do about it, you got to help me. Instead of offering solutions, the therapist says, well, what would you like to do about it? And if they're really invested in the game, they might say, well, you're the therapist, I don't know, that's why I'm coming to you. What should I do? And the therapist can say back, yes, I am the therapist, and I'm very willing to think with you and help you problem solve this, but I'm not willing to discount you as a person and your ability to think and your responsibility for the problem. Oh, okay. So then the therapist can elicit questions about what the client wants what they feel like would be beneficial for them from their parent, what would meet their values and so forth, and together come up with an agreement about the change the client wants to make, and the therapist agrees to work with them to accomplish that. So it's really a cooperative process rather than a one-up, one-down therapist taking responsibility and trying to fix the client against their will.
As a practicing therapist who loves the TA work, it was ironic when I was doing some family systems work that I would often get caught up in games. So recently, after doing about a year's work with a family system, the adult came in and the adult made the conversation at the house that we're going to wait to share this in therapy tomorrow. And the kids did not believe it, so they was wanting to get their thoughts and processes out. So for them to bring their game into the counseling session and have a mutual person to understand all parties just eliminated the whole drama triangle, and it was just so interesting after a year's work to really see that unfold. So looking at the contracting and really understanding what everybody wants, it was amazing to allow the kids to see that the parents' goal was not to criticize them and punish them, but to correct them in a positive way.
Right.
And it's just allowing them to have their voice and have a working component and get out of the drama triangle. It was so unfamiliar, and the relaxation within the family system is so unique.
That's great.
Just
Congratulations.
Thank
Good
you.
work.
I find that when you make the contract and identify the goal for the work, that it becomes an affirmation. And a lot of the work has been done already, identifying the goal. And you can read, like for instance, I'm depressed. I've been very depressed, so what do you want to be instead? I want to be happy and productive. So I'm in the process of learning how to be happy and productive is the affirmation that all begins to be the healing process,
Right.
just the making of the contract.
Good.
It's important in my experience to be aware of when the person has to the second question, what is this good for you? And do you have, does this go with your values? Do you have parental support? If the person is got a lot of critical parent, then the work may include learning to nurture oneself first. And we can go down the road and do a lot of contracting that doesn't go anywhere. And I love the sabotage piece because that's one way to get at it. But the other is to be aware of how much energy in the nurturing parent exists in the clients that you're working with, and taking a step back if you need to. And I think that one of the ways that internalized oppression works, survival behaviors work, and trauma, this relates to the trauma point, is that we may have a very intense internal critical parent that was keeping us safe, and that can become a barrier to our being fully present to what we actually want.